Frank Belknap Long was a prolific American writer of horror fiction, fantasy, science fiction, poetry, gothic romance, comic books, and non-fiction. Though his writing career spans 7 decades, he is best known for his horror and science fiction short stories, including early contributions to the Cthulhu Mythos. During his life, Long received the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement, the Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement, and the first Fandom Hall of Fame Award. Biography. He was born in Manhattan, New York City on April 27, 1901. He grew up in the Harlem area of Manhattan. His father was a prosperous dentist and his mother was maid doty. The family resided at 823 West End Avenue in Manhattan. A lifelong resident of New York City, he was educated in the New York City public school system. As a boy, he was fascinated by natural history, and wrote that he dreamed of running away from home and explore the great rainforests of the Amazon. Quote, he developed his interest in the weird by reading the Oz books, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells, as well as Ambrose Bierce and Edgar Allan Poe. Though writing was to be his life's work, he once commented that as important as writing is, I could have been completely happy if I had a secure position in a field that has always had a tremendous emotion and an imaginative appeal for me, that of natural history. In his late teens, he was active in the United Amateur Press Association, in which he won a prize from the Boys' World and thus discovered amateur journalism. His first published tale was Dr. Whitlock's Price. Long's story, The Eye Above the Mantle, in UAPA caught the eye of H.P. Lovecraft, sparking a friendship and correspondence that would endure until Lovecraft's death in 1937. Long attended New York University from 1920 to 1921, studying journalism, but later transferred to Columbia, leaving without a degree. In 1921, he suffered a severe attack of appendicitis, leading to a ruptured appendix and peritonitis. He spent a month in New York's Roosevelt Hospital, where he came close to dying. Long's brush with death propelled him into a decision that he would leave college to pursue a freelance writing career. In 1923, at the age of 22, he sold his first short story, The Desert Lich, to Weird Tales magazine. Throughout the next 4 decades, Long was to be a frequent contributor to pulp magazines, including 2 of the most famous, Weird Tales and Astounding Science Fiction. Long was an active freelance writer, also publishing many non-fiction articles. His first book, the scarce volume A Man from Genoa and Other Poems, was published in 1926 by W. Paul Cook. The poems in this collection won praise from a great variety of writers, among them Arthur Machen, Clifford Gessler, Robinson Jeffers, William Ellery Leonard, John Drinkwater, John Masefield and George Sterling. His second published book was also a volume of fantastic poetry, The Goblin Tower, published jointly by H.P. Lovecraft and Robert H. Barlow. A Horror from the Hills, a story serialized in 1931 in Weird Tales and one of Long's best-known works, incorporated almost verbatim a dream H.P. Lovecraft related to him in a letter. The short novel was published many years later in separate book form by Arkham House in 1963, The Horror from the Hills. In the late 1930s, Long turned his hand to science fiction, writing for Astounding Science Fiction. He also contributed horror stories to Unknown, later called Unknown Worlds. Long contributed an episode to the round-robin story, The Challenge from Beyond. His later science fiction works include the story collection John Carstairs' Space Detective, and the novels Space Station 1, Mars is My Destination and It Was the Day of the Robot. In pulp such as thrilling Wanda stories and startling stories during the 1940s. Long sometimes wrote using the pseudonym Leslie Northern. What Long characterized as a minor disability kept him out of World War II and writing full-time during the early 1940s. Long reputedly ghost wrote 2, possibly 3, of the Ellery Queen Jr. novels, but unfortunately did not identify the 3 titles. He also wrote comic books in the 1940s, including horror stories for Adventures into the Unknown, and scripts for Planet Comics, Superman, Congo Bill, DC's Golden Age Green Lantern, and the Fawcett Comics Captain Marvel. He also worked in the 1940s as a script reader for 20th Century Fox. Long also wrote crime and weird menace stories for 10 Gang Mystery and other magazines. During the 1940s, Long lived in California. In 1946, Arkham House published Long's first collection of supernatural fiction, The Hounds of Tinderlows, which collected 21 of his best tales from the previous 20 years of magazine publication. It featured works which had appeared in such pulps as Weird Tales, Astounding Stories, Super Science, Unknown, Thrilling Wonder Stories, and others. In The Man from Time, a time traveler from the future has an encounter with writer F. Scott Fitzgerald. Ever versatile as a writer, Long changed with the times. In the 1950s, he was uncredited associate editor on the St. Mystery magazine and Fantastic Universe. He was associate editor on Satellite Science Fiction, 1959, on short stories, 1959-60, and on Mike Shane Mystery magazine until 1966. Long several times met fellow Weird Tales writer and poet Joseph Payne Brennan, and later provided the foreword for Brennan's The Chronicles of Lucius Leffing. After the decline of the pulps, Long moved into writing science fiction and Gothic romance novels. Long wrote 9 modern Gothic novels, starting with Siddhartha Heritage in 1966, 8 of which were published as by Lyda Belknap Long's first name and his middle name and surname. All were entirely his own work and were workmanlike products intended to support him and his wife rather than to be of high literary quality. According to Elsa J. Radcliffe, Crucible of Evil is a very clumsy tale both in plot and writing style. Much of the suspense seems contrived and the plot tediously simplistic. Long also published collections of his short stories and poetry, a biography of H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Dream on the Night Side, and his own autobiographical memoir. Illumination on his own life and work is also provided by his introduction to the early Long, a collection of his best early stories. He married Lyda Arko, a Russian descended from a line of actors in the Yiddish theater who ran a salon in Chelsea, NY. In 1960, they stayed together till Long's death in 1994, but he had no children. Long described himself as an agnostic. Referring to Lovecraft, Long wrote that he always shared H.P.L's skepticism concerning the entire range of alleged supernatural occurrences and what is commonly defined as the occult. Long died on January 3, 1994 at the age of 92 at St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Center in Manhattan. He was survived by his wife, Lyda. Due to his poverty, he was interred in a potter's field for indigents. Friends and colleagues, on learning of this indignity, had his remains moved and reinterred at New York City's Woodlawn Cemetery, in a family plot near that of Lovecraft's grandparents. Despite a 7-decade career as a writer, he had died impoverished after many years living in the Chelsea district of Manhattan. Long's fans contributed over $3,000 to have his name engraved upon the tombstone of his family plot. Lyda died shortly after Frank and her ashes were scattered on his grave. Legacy. Frank Belknap Long left behind a body of work that included 29 novels, 150 short stories, 8 collections of short stories, 3 poetry collections, and numerous freelance magazine articles and comic book scripts. Author Ray Bradbury summed up Long's career. Frank Belknap Long has lived through a major part of science fiction history in the U.S., has known most of the writers personally, or has corresponded with them, and has, with his own writing, helped shape the field when most of us were still in our early teens. Friendship with Lovecraft. The genius of Mr. Long is a spontaneous and self-expressive one. H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft was a close friend and mentor to Frank Belknap Long, with whom he came in contact in 1920 when Long was but 19. Lovecraft found Long a stimulating correspondent, especially in regard to his aesthetic tastes, focusing on the Italian Renaissance and French literature. Lovecraft published some of Long's early work in his conservative and paid tribute to Long in a flattering article, The Work of Frank Belknap Long, June, published anonymously in the United Amateur but clearly by Lovecraft. They first met when Lovecraft visited New York in April 1922. They saw each other with great frequency, at which time they were the chief members of the Calem Club and wrote to each other often. Long's family apartment was always Lovecraft's residence and headquarters during his periodic trips from Providence to New York. Long writes that he and Lovecraft exchanged more than 1,000 letters, not a few running to more than 80 handwritten pages before Lovecraft's death in 1937. Some of the correspondence has been reprinted in Arkham House's Selected Letters series, collecting the voluminous correspondence of Lovecraft and his friends. Long's Howard Phillips Lovecraft Dream on the Night Side was extensively edited by James Turner. During the 1930s, Long and Lovecraft were both members of the Calem Club. Long was also part of the loosely associated Lovecraft Circle of fantasy writers who corresponded regularly with each other and influenced and critiqued each other's works. Long wrote a brief preface to the stillborn edition of Lovecraft's The Shunned House. Lovecraft, in turn, ghostwrote for Long the preface to Mrs. William B. Simmer's Old World Footprints, a slim poetry collection by Long's aunt. Long's short novel The Horror from the Hills incorporates verbatim a letter by Lovecraft recounting his great Roman dream of Halloween 1927. Long teamed with Lovecraft in a revision service with Lovecraft in 1928. Long's parents frequently took Lovecraft on various motor trips between 1929 and 1930, and Lovecraft visited Long at Christmas between 1932 and 1935 inclusive. Lovecraft helped set type for Long's second poetry collection, The Goblin Tower, correcting some of Long's faulty meter in the process. Lovecraft's letters to Long after 1931 have all been lost, with the letters up to that date existing primarily in transcriptions prepared by Arkham House. The Long-Lovecraft friendship was fictionalized in Peter Cannon's 1985 novel Pulp Time, being a singular adventure of Sherlock Holmes, Lovecraft, and the Calem Club as if narrated by Frank Belknap Long, Jr. Long was a guest of honor at the Lovecraft Centennial Conference in Providence in 1990. Long wrote a number of early Cthulhu Mythos stories. These included The Hounds of Tindalos, The Horror from the Hills, and The Space Eaters. A number of other works by Long can be considered as falling within the Cthulhu Mythos. These include The Brain Eaters and The Malignant Invader, as well as such poems as The Abominable Snowman and When Chorna Wakes. A later Mythos story, Dark Awakening, appeared in New Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos. The story portrays the influence of Long's pseudonymous romantic fiction, and the final paragraph was added by the editor at Long's suggestion. The Hounds of Tyndallow's are Long's most famous fictional creation. The hounds were a pack of foul and incomprehensibly alien beasts, emerging from strange angles in dim recesses of non-Euclidean space before the dawn of time, to pursue travelers down the corridors of time. They could only enter our reality via angles, where they would mangle and exsanguinate the victims, leaving behind only a peculiar bluish pus or ichor. Influence on popular culture. The Hounds of Tyndallow's have been used as reference by many later mythos writers, including Ramsey Campbell, Lynn Carter, and Brian Lumley. Long's Hounds of Tyndallow's have also inspired a number of metal and electronic music artists, such as Metallica, Epoch of Unlight, Edith Byron's group Beowulf, Fireaxe, Brian Voth, and Universe Zero, all of whom have recorded tracks based upon the story. Bibliography. Poetry. A Man from Genoa. The Goblin Tower, Cassia F.L., Dragonfly Press, 1935, New Collectors Group, 1945. Note: due to the somewhat misleading publisher's introduction to the 1945 edition, it is often miscatalogued as a reprint of the 1935 Dragonfly Press edition. In fact, the selection of poems differs. The New Collectors Group edition drops 4, When Chauner Wakes, Exotic Quest, quote, West Indies, and Marshall, The Vacationist, and adds 3, The Prophet, Prediction, and Walt Whitman. The collection is not to be confused with the novel of the same title by L. Sprague de Camp. On reading Arthur Machen, The Marriage of Sir John de Mandeville, John Mandeville, in May and Splendor, When Chauner Wakes, Chauner Fawn, a chapbook of the single poem, originally published in Weird Tales 20, No. 3 and reprinted in May and Splendor. The Darkling Tide, previously uncollected poetry, novels. Space Station 1, Mission to a Distant Star, Woman from Another Planet, The Horror Expert, The Mating Center, Mars is My Destination, The Horror from the Hills, expanded edition as odd science fiction. 3 Steps Spaceward, It Was the Day of the Robot, reprint, Dennis Dobson, 1964. The Martian Visitors, Mission to a Star, Lest Earth Be Conquered, reissue as The Androids, This Strange Tomorrow, Siddhartha Heritage, Journey into Darkness, ... and Others Shall Be Born. The Three Faces of Time, To the Dark Tower, Monster from Out of Time, reprinted in H.C. London, Robert Hale, 1971. Survival World, The Witch Tree, Fire of the Witches, The Shape of Fear, The Night of the Wolf, House of the Deadly Nightshade, Legacy of Evil, Crucible of Evil, The Lemoyne Heritage, Rehearsal Night, G.H.O. Kinslayer, Story Collections. The Hounds of Tyndallow's, reprints, London, Museum Press, 1950. N.Y., Belmont Books, August 1963. John Carstairs, Space Detective, reprints, Toronto, MacLeod, 1949, Kemsley, 1951. The Horror from the Hills, Odd Science Fiction, reprint, London, Brown Watson, 1965. The Dark Beasts and 8 Other Stories from the Hounds of Tyndallow's, contains half the contents of the 1946 The Hounds of Tyndallow's collection. The Rim of the Unknown, reprint, Condor Books, 1978. The Black Druid and Other Stories, A Dangerous Experiment, The Early Long Night Fear, Escape from Tomorrow. 3 previously unreprinted Weird Tales, The Man Who Died Twice and AMP. 3 others. Plays a guest in the house. Recordings. Audio recording of author panel discussion from First World Fantasy Convention, Providence, 1975. Long's voice was preserved on a flexi-disc record of the speech issued with the fanzine Murdam Issue 3. The other side of the flexi-disc contains a recording of Robert Bloch's speech from the convention. Memoirs of H.P. Lovecraft, Random Memories of H.P. Lovecraft, H.P. Ellen Redhook, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Dream on the Night Side, H.P. Lovecraft, poem, Weird Tales, reprinted in Mayan Splendor, Introductions to books by others, Joseph Payne Brennan, The Chronicles of Lucius Leffing, Donald M. Grant, publisher, 1977. Richard Lupoff, The Return of Skullface. Fax Collectors Editions. Awards. First Fandom Hall of Fame Award, World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement, Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement. Media Adaptations. Long's short story The Space Eaters was adapted as episode 63 of the television series Monsters, starring Richard Clark, Matt Halswit and Richard M. Hughes.